Thanks, Louise, and of course now my mouse doesn't move the way it should. Logistics. We can't hear you if you talk, so feel free to talk, but it won't get to us. If you want to ask a question, there's this little question box, so type your question in there, and we will get it and we will handle it. And a copy of the slides will be available to you. You'll get an email tomorrow telling you how to get the slides, and you can even watch the recording over and over and over again, and even get credits for it. Quick bio. I should have forced Louise to be on the slide as well if I have to show my mug. But I've been working at Parasoft for over 20 years. I work on a lot of different things in the software development life cycle. Lately, been doing a lot more security than anything else. I don't know that security got more dangerous, but we certainly become more aware of it. And so I think it'll be a very interesting day to talk about some things you can do to avoid the kinds of high-profile problems you've been seeing. Actually, I'm going to go backward for just a second. You probably saw this funny little animation in the beginning. This is a website you can go to. It's Norse IP Viking, and they have honey pots stuck around the world, and they monitor out there hacking all the. They're originating from all over the world and targeting all over the world. So it's and context for you today, InfoSec or things like that. There's a lot of confusion about the different areas of it because it is a vast, vast area. So there's this big area that is kind of the physical security that we've gotten relatively good at, and companies even think about it. We carry ID cards, the doors locked to the building, we do background checks, we have alarm systems, things like that that really protect the physical building itself and hopefully the computers as well. At the operational level, we have all kinds of similar devices protecting the network, protecting the computers, so firewalls, logs that see what's going on, monitoring, good old-fashioned antivirus, VPNs for security and things like that. When we talk application security, all of those things can work perfectly, and we can still have an application get penetrated. So now we're looking at different kinds of tools, and now we talk in terms of things like dynamic application security testing, or DAST, static application security testing, or SAST. Penetration testing is a thing that people talk about quite a bit, so that's the realm that we're going to talk about today. We're going to presume that the physical is locked down, that the network is locked down, that we have our antivirus, anti-malware software, etc., and we still have this little application area. And again, recognize that all kinds of other things can happen still, like phishing attacks, etc. But if anyone's not aware, security problems are growing. Again, when I started at Parasoft, we didn't have a firewall. That may sound insane to anybody who's young. The places we connected to didn't have a firewall. Our provider was Caltech, and they didn't have a firewall. We did work for NASA, and they didn't have a firewall. It was just not a thing that you put up on your network. These days, it would be insane to run without a firewall, right? You wouldn't last for minutes on the net before something found you. And a lot of this surge has come from the fact that very sophisticated tools are available on the dark web, so people can just buy them without being very educated. And also that the nature of the attacks has changed in the sense that it used to be human-driven, targeted, and now it's just automatic. The computers just run loose. They find an IP address, they scan it for ports, they start to look at what kind of apps are there and start trying various known ways to attack systems. So it used to be people would say things like, hey, my company doesn't do anything interesting, no one's going to attack me. But that's just not true anymore. You can test this yourself. Start a web server somewhere at home, open up a port, and monitor the logs and see how quickly you get attacked, even though you haven't published it. If you could only get users as fast as you could get attacks. And the thing that we have to remember in the security arena, it's a little different than the quality arena in the sense that if we have a few little bugs, minor problems, we don't worry about them so much necessarily when we go to market. With security vulnerabilities, it's like the Death Star. One little weak spot is all that it takes to take a system. Susceptibility to a script, take a buffer overflow, all these kinds of little things, little sources for future zero-day attacks. So we have to approach. There's another interesting thing to think about, whether or not quality and security are fundamentally different. And the truth is that most of the vulnerabilities that people are exploiting in software these days are really just taking advantage of bugs in the application, good old-fashioned software defects. It might be, again, it doesn't do validation properly. It might be that it doesn't do memory handling properly, so you can do overflows or memory leaks, or that you can crash an application, or that it's displaying logging information that it shouldn't, or things like that. So if we look at some of the studies out there, 1 to 5% of software defects are exposed, attackable security vulnerabilities that people can reach. So it's very important to make sure that we're not just looking at security issues, but we're fixing traditional things. I actually worked with one of our senior engineers last year when the Heartbleed came out. And Heartbleed was this OpenSSL vulnerability that suddenly this library that everything that we use consumes, and we're all exposed to it, and it was really a read overflow. It was the application not properly checking the boundaries of the memory that it was going to read into the variable that it had. And I showed it to one of our developers, and I said, "Is this a security vulnerability?" It's like, "No, that's not a security issue. It's just it's a read overflow. You get some bad data." And then he stopped and went, "Oh wait, but it depends, right? What's in the next block of memory?" So it's an interesting perspective. Another funny one that you think about unreachable code. And in a Java application, unreachable code may well be unreachable. In a C application, unreachable code with a write overflow or a read overflow can put you at the location of memory where someone's left a back door. So it's very interesting the ways that the people who hack into applications have learned to subvert the application's behavior. When I think about the big point-of-sale attack that happened at Target, it's not super complex to program, but it was a super novel approach. If it was a normal company that had developed the technique, it might well have been patentable because no one's ever done it that way before. But super easy now that someone's done it for someone else to do it. So again, you have to think about security and reliability. You have to design them in, engineer them in, build them in. You can't test them in. And this is a funny thing about security groups at organizations, because typically when a company starts worrying about security, the first thing they do is hire a chief security officer, set up a security organization, set up some testing, and it's completely orthogonal to the software development, which means, again, that they think they can build the software and then test it and it'll be secure. And you can't test quality into software. You can't test security into software. Testing merely tells you whether or not you've built secure software. If your testing for security comes at the end, all it will do is tell you you don't have secure software. If you have a question about that, call me. I'll tell you you don't have secure software because you don't. So you have to take a much more proactive approach. And the 3 important steps are really training is number 1. I often see developers take output from a tool that'll say, hey, there's a weakness here, a vulnerability here. Sometimes tools will tell them an exploit for the vulnerability, so it'll say, hey, here's the buffer overflow, and if I put this specific value in here and then I go over here, this specific exploit is suddenly available. On the other hand, sometimes it'll just say, hey, look, this code's susceptible to the buffer overflow, and developers will frequently say, oh, well, I don't see how it is, or I don't know why it matters, I don't think it's important, or it's handled somewhere else, and without the actual exploit, they believe that it's not important. And this is literally a matter of training. When the developer says, I don't get it, I don't know why that's important, I don't think that's important, when he's using a security tool, those are signs that there's not enough training, that they don't understand how software weaknesses can be turned into exploits and used to attack your application. So you have to design the system with a deliberate focus on quality and security. And we'll talk about these different ways to design it and some hints that you can use to bootstrap your knowledge and understand what the right way to build is. And again, as in any quality process, we can go back to, Deming 101, collect and measure defect data, and we use it to assess and improve our development practices. So we look at what kinds of things are happening. Are they exploitable? Why are they happening? Why are we writing code this way? How can we detect it earlier? How can we write code in a different way? And that's where static analysis will really come in as we start to look at it. So now we have the first poll, and Reeves, if you could kick it off. We're going to ask what you're doing today for application security. So you have a couple of choices here. Maybe you guys are doing it. It's solid. It's built into your process. It's something you do every day. You think about it. You're running static analysis, dynamic analysis, pen tests. You've got people doing peer reviews, things like that. You might be doing an okay job. You've got some things. You run some tests, but you feel like you could do a better job. Maybe it's just ad hoc or sporadic. You do it when you have to. Every now and then you think about it. If you have time in a sprint, you throw in some pen tests. You hire a couple of guys to look at it. Or maybe you're just like, what? Security? We're supposed to do that? So the answers are coming in. It's kind of interesting. Not too surprising, although I feel like more people have it built in than I would have expected, which makes me really feel better, because sometimes in my job I go around, I talk to people about security, and I come home and I feel like I'll never get in an airplane again. I'm never going to drive a car that was built after 1970, and I'm taking all my money and sticking it under my mattress. So it's nice to see that some of you have really started to take application security more seriously. So it looks like, Louise, the voting's kind of slowed down, so we'll go ahead and close the poll. So 39% of you say that you've got it built into your process, which again, it means that 60% of you are probably open to being penetrated, but it's still a bigger number than I thought. So there's a good and a bad side of the message. 58% of you said you're doing something, but it could be better, and that's great, and we're going to try and show you how static analysis can be that better thing. 14% said it's ad hoc, so you people need to start somewhere with something, and we'll show you hopefully something today, and 11% are in that say what category. So again, not too surprising. It's kind of the normal state of affairs. So let's talk about this idea for security and the core understanding of, do we fix things or do we prevent things? Again, with security, we tend to take a kind of a zero-day approach where we say, oh, look, we did a pen test, we found this thing, we had a hacker come in and review our code, we found this thing, we fixed this one thing. And I always worry about, well, where else is that one thing? Is there other places that do the same kind of thing? If I was building a house, I would say, ooh, I found a bad 2x4 in the shipment. I'd want to go inspect the other 2x4s. How many of them are bad? So we talk about fixing versus preventing. And there's a very interesting story, right? The Tower of Pisa, as you all know, is over there in Italy, and it's leaning a little more every year. I don't remember how much. It's a tiny, tiny amount. But ultimately, someday, unless someone comes up with a very, very, very clever way to deal with it, or build a giant scaffold that's ugly, the thing's going to fall over. It'll pass the tipping point, and that'll be the end of it. And the reason it'll fall over is that it was not built on solid ground. It's just not the right place to build the tower unless you do something extraordinary to make it stand upright. So this is a thing you can't fix, right? You can patch, you can fight a holding action for it for a very long time, but you can't get ahead of the problem. Now, a lot of people don't realize, if you've been to Washington, D.C., there's this Washington Monument, and if you look at the layout of the center part of the Capitol, you'll see that we have the White House, we have the Washington Monument in the middle, we have the Jefferson Memorial, the Lincoln Memorial, and Congress, and they form this big cross, if you will. And at the center is supposed to be the Washington Monument, and we all kind of think of it that way. But if you go to Google Earth, you'll see that it's not so, that the other four line up, but this Washington Monument is not in the center. And the interesting thing is that when they started to build this monument, somebody got clever, and rather than just say, hey, let's build it, here we go, they started to put it together, and they did a lot of design and architectural work, and they said, you know what, the soil here isn't going to hold it, and we're going to have a Tower of Pisa on our hands. And so they started spreading out and testing, and they finally found a solid piece of ground, but it's something like 100 feet off of where it would have been. So they actually moved the tower. That's the preventative move. They didn't fix the tower, straighten it up, bolster it. They said proactively, will this land hold a tower up straight of this size and weight? No, it won't. What can we do about it? In this case, the answer wasn't build a fatter tower or put giant scaffolding on it. It was let's move the tower itself. And that's how software prevention works. It's not about doing pen testing externally and saying, okay, we found the bug before the hacker found it. That's great. In some sense, it's a form of prevention, but it's really not prevention so much as early detection. It's very early detection before the hackers found it, but it's not about hardening your code and making it so that it can't be hacked. It's not about building a tower that can't tip, right? And that's what we want to do to our software. So what are some of the kinds of things that we can do? And obviously, there's different areas. Coding standards is one area. That's where our traditional static analysis comes in. So things like naming conventions, best practices, quality best practices, security best practices, and we'll talk about some good ones there. Documentation can be an important coding standard because, as we all know, code ends up being worked on different people over time. And in fact, many of us who've been on the same code base for years have understood that you can pick up a piece of code that you haven't seen in a couple of years, look at it, you go, what on earth was this idiot thinking when they wrote that? Oh, that was me. So documentation becomes a critical piece to preventing errors because you don't reintroduce problems when you've written code in a certain way. Policies around what you're going to allow, what you're going to do, what processes you're going to use, what standards you're going to apply, runtime policies, how much of the code has to be tested, what kinds of testing does it have to have, what kind of performance does it have to have, what kind of issues will I allow through into the released product, what kind of issues have to be fixed. At the runtime, how many people can I handle? If I handle too many, will the system crash? Will it give up information? I was on a telecom website for a cellular phone, and you know, these cell phones go through these weird pop culture cycles. So a new phone comes out and they get slammed. Everybody wants the new phone the day it comes out because somehow it's better than the day after that. So I was on one of these websites and suddenly it had a problem, and when it had a problem, it displays to the screen the name of the database machine, the IP address of the machine, the name of the login user, and the name of the application that the database was actually running. So it told me that it was Oracle version whatever. So now all I got to do is a brute force password attack. It told me everything I need to know because under load, the application started to behave insecurely. So all these pieces are part of a holistic error prevention policy and practice. The basic idea is that we all have application already, right? I don't think anybody here's writing new code. If you're writing new code, you probably start with coding standards. But for a more pragmatic approach, you start testing for security. You do, maybe it's peer review, code inspection, pen test, hire an expert to try and work their way in, whatever it is. You find some vulnerabilities, you isolate them. Then the interesting part isn't you go and fix them, it's you put in the policy. So again, if I find that my application is subject to tainted data, meaning that cross-site scripting can occur, SQL injection can occur, things like that, then I'm going to put in a policy that doesn't say, hey, let's not allow cross-site scripting. My policy is we must do strong validation at the moment that the data comes in, and we'll show that in a moment. And then I'm going to go out and fix not just the one vulnerability I found, but all of the others. And the important key here is I'm going to put it into a regression test, making sure that it doesn't happen to me again. And as many of you probably know, when Sony was breached a couple of years ago, not the recent one, but the PlayStation Network breach that was SQL injection, it took them a week or two to come back online. They were online for a day or two, and they got hacked again, same problem. So obviously somebody fixed something, and in the course of doing some other repairs, somebody undid a fix. So it's important that these security tests become part of our regular regression tests. Again, they can't be orthogonal to our software development. They have to be built in. And the other part to remember, again, is that we have this old-fashioned idea that somehow the application we're running is behind a protected area. It's in a castle, and there's a moat and a drawbridge, and we're okay. And something somewhere else is taking care of security. We just can't think it that way anymore. The applications are being exposed, and even one little piece of them being exposed leads to other pieces being exposed, and you'd be shocked when you do a real analysis about how simply adding a database to an app server, and the database isn't directly exposed from the internet, but because the app server has a web form that is, the database is now actually exposed in a much more open sense than you'd believe it was. The other thing to know that's interesting, if you're worried about all this, is that input validation covers a huge swath of potential issues. If we look at the OWASP top 10, these days about 70% of it is really variance on a theme that says do really strong, good input validation. The OWASP top 10 and CWE top 25 are great starting points, and we'll have some links to those later on that will show you how to go after them. But the basic idea is let's get some coding standards and let's build secure software. And there's a bunch of different organizations out there, and the question a lot of people have is which ones? How do I implement them? How do I know it's working? What do I do if it isn't working? And I've listed out here probably the most popular ones, the OWASP, which is the Open Web Application Security Project. It's free. OWASP.org, you can go there. If you're driving around and you see a license plate that says OWASP on it, it's my car, you can honk and wave. It's a great free way to train your people and to learn what's important. We'll show the reasons why they choose their standards in a moment. CWE is the Common Weakness Enumeration. They work in conjunction with the SANS Institute. They have, at the moment, I think 800 different kinds of software vulnerabilities described in a common way so that they're tool independent. So instead of saying tool A calls this a buffer overflow and tool B calls this a read overflow, then we can understand that they're a CWE number 27, and so we have a way to talk about different tools in an abstract, generic sense. So CWE is very interesting in being able to have discussions about things. They also have a lot of good training because they look at root cause. What can the error lead to? What kind of problems? Will it lead to denial of service? Will it lead to loss of data? Will it lead to privacy issues, things like that? So it's great to train around that. They have a top 25, just like the OWASP top 10. So again, if you're getting started, picking one of the two, they're free. When you're buying tools like a static analysis tool or a pen test tool, you can buy tools that support these standards so that they report the way that these standards expect. Cigital has Secure Coding Pack. It's great. HIPAA is a secure coding standard for healthcare. If you're not doing healthcare, it's not necessarily a bad idea. It's got some pretty strong controls. If you are doing healthcare and you're not doing HIPAA, you're in trouble. Someone's going to get you. You'll end up getting sued, so do it. SAMMate is a program run from the U.S. government through NIST, the Static Analysis and Metrics Tools Exposition that looks at various static analysis tools to help understand the state of the art and try and push the state of the art forward. So if you type into your browser NIST SAMMate, again, we'll have a link later, you can go there, you can learn about it, you can participate in education sessions twice a year. They cost nothing. They do happen to be held in DC. Twice a year they also have working groups. If you're interested in getting involved in the security arena and helping push the state of the art forward. So I encourage you to look at that. Oracle has works with CERT as well to do the secure coding guidelines. Sometimes organizations require those of you. They're very popular overseas. In the U.S., probably more CWE than CERT these days. And Microsoft has their own secure coding guidelines, although they only apply to .NET. So if you're doing C or Java on Microsoft, their guidelines probably won't help you too much. So there's some ideas. But I wanted to talk specifically about what a coding standard is. It's kind of become a thing that we say it and it's just a word. And so coding standards to programmer means, oh, it's a set of rules in static analysis. It's some things that I'm supposed to do. But a coding standard to me is like a building standard. It's not just, oh, somebody made up some arbitrary rules. It's some people who are very clever sat down, did some root cause analysis, looked at what kinds of programming practices lead to unsafe code, what kind lead to safe code, testable code, reliable code, what language features, like in C, especially in C++, are fundamentally unsafe, and I just shouldn't use them because they're highly exploitable, and in many cases there's code that it works, but there's a better alternative. And this is the really interesting nature of coding standards, because again, we're used to testing security in, and so the test finds for me an actual exploit, whereas coding standard says, wow, you're building a house and you used a 2x4 and they're 16 inches apart, but you're going to put a heavy second floor on there and they need to be 12 inches apart. You wrote that code in such a way that you did some input validation, but it's not going to catch every form. You did those threads in a way that they can be exploited if you get too heavy of a load. You did your memory management in a way that can be exploited. That's the purpose of coding standards, is they're just like building standards, engineering standards, electrical standards, plumbing standards, highway standards that we use when we build cars, when we build airplanes, when we build houses, to keep things safe. And that is the purpose of these coding standards. So it's not just to find bugs. And in software, we've fallen into a trap where if it doesn't show me a bug, I presume it's a false positive, and that label gets bandied about all the time. And people talk about it as if 80% of what comes out of static analysis tools is false positive. I can tell you that I've measured, and other software static analysis tool vendors have measured, and modern reasonable static analysis tools produce 15% false positives, meaning the tool actually got the message wrong. That means that other 65% people think are false positives are training issues, where people don't understand that this is unsafe, that there's a better way to do it, that yes, the code works, but you don't realize that a clever programmer can exploit this piece. And I have to tell you, if you're evaluating a static analysis tool and it doesn't tell you something you don't know, then it's not a very good tool. It needs to tell you something you don't know. That's its goal in life. So again, if we think about it like building standards, right? You build a building crappy, it tips over, it falls down. You build your software crappy, you'll be forever patching it, forever having security vulnerabilities, zero-day attacks, exploits, and constantly trying to keep the thing safe. And you just can't really, you know, I live in Southern California. We build houses out of stucco here. I could put bars on my windows. You can still go through the wall with a conventional sledgehammer. It wouldn't take minutes. I cannot turn my house into Fort Knox, no matter how much security testing I do on it.
Arthur, we have a question.
Sure.
Going to the earlier slide, how many of the secure coding and testing practices apply to embedded firmware, especially software safety critical software? Are there unique security methods for embedded firmware?
So yeah, typically in embedded we take even a stronger approach. What happens in embedded is that we lose a lot of the frameworky, webby type of things. So we look less at input validation because the device is working in a closed ecosystem. So a lot of the web type rules we just turn off, but the language specific rules become even more critical because the cost of dealing with embedded system failures is much, much higher, right? We have to issue a firmware patch, get it out to the market, and the loss of market assurance in our product is extremely expensive. But the rules tend to be highly similar with the exception of those two areas I mentioned. If you're doing embedded, I would normally recommend looking at something like MISRA or Joint Strike Fighter. MISRA is the Motor Industry Safety something. It's for cars, but it's a really good set of coding standards designed around embedded, and there's nothing there that I wouldn't feel comfortable applying to any embedded code. And Joint Strike Fighter it builds on embedded and goes a little further. It's more strict in some sense. It's more modern. It's designed to build aircraft and to keep them from falling into the ground, because again, if something fails in your app and it has to reboot, you feel like maybe it's not such a big deal. If it's an aircraft flying at Mach 3, maybe it is a big deal. But it's a great, actually embedded software development standard. So those are two great ones that you can use. And we'll have links to those at the end. So OWASP has a very interesting view of doing risk management. So when OWASP builds their top 10, they have these 4 different areas that they measure. Instead of just going, well, here's out of all the kinds of problems you can have, we like these 10. They look at the prevalence. How likely is an application to have that vulnerability, which is an important thing, because if we look at something and we go, well, no one's exploiting it, and it's hard to exploit and unlikely to happen, it's not so critical. Detectability, will someone be able to find it? Because the more detectable it is, even if it's minor, the more important it is that you plug the leak. Exploitability, how hard is it to exploit? What kind of technical expertise? Are there tools out there that will do it for you? Is it going to take somebody 17 different pieces of data that requires them to be in the building to have physical access to the machine? That is less important than the thing that, you know, a 12-year-old kid can do in his spare time at school when he's supposed to be listening to his teacher. And what's the impact? Again, and CWE does a very good job in this area understanding the impact. They actually label different areas and tell you the impact of this is denial of service, it's security, it's performance, it's whatever. So, but understanding what happens if this is exploited, that's a very critical piece to understand as you're trying to manage your risk. So I wanted to throw a couple of preventative coding standards up just to get a feel. And again, these are the sort of standards, if you've never done static analysis, developers will typically push back on, and they'll say, hey, that's not important. I don't need to do that. That's not a bug. I'm not saying it's a bug. I'm saying this is a building standard, and if you do it this way, it's less solid than if you do it the other way. So like the first thing, if I use public fields instead of a package field or a private field or a protected field, I'm exposing information, and I'm allowing people to override things. So I might have an input validation method that I'm allowing someone to override. So these kinds of things can all have security ramification. If you look at any of these later and you feel like, hey, I don't know why that's important, I don't get why that's important, feel free to send me an email. I'll send you the page of the docs that talks about this coding standard and show you why it's important. But that's my goal with this slide, is to understand that your first read will frequently make you think, oh, I don't get it, that doesn't matter to me. But if you look at the docs should explain it to you. If your tool doesn't have docs, don't use it, okay? If your tool doesn't have docs that explain why something matters to your satisfaction, then you shouldn't use it. You may well read the docs and say, oh, that doesn't apply to me, and that's okay. But the docs should explain the context. Here's why this is important. Here's the kind of problems it leads to, and here's how to fix it. That's what you're looking for in your static analysis tool. So we're going to have another poll. Louise, if we could start poll number 2, and we're going to ask a little bit about how you feel about static analysis. And I find that people are all over the place. There's a guy that does a lot of government contracting work. They call him the software angel of death, and I always forget his real name, but he loves static analysis. Never saw a thing he didn't like. He'll tell you, you know what, don't even think about false positives. Just get in there and fix every single thing in static analysis. And he takes the strictest build it in security mentality. Fix every single thing. Some people use static analysis because you have to. There's a government constraint. There's a upstream contractor that requires it. There's you know, other types of things. There's some standards, ISO 26262 for functional safety and transportation that requires it. Sometimes we use it because a boss told us the team uses it. We're new on the team, but we just don't like it. We're still using it, but it's making me crazy. Don't see the value. And some people just feel like, oh, this thing is just too noisy. I don't see the value at all. I don't know why people do it. And people fall all over the spectrum. And I think some of these come from how people use static analysis, which is what I want to help point out, that there's some of it is configuration, some of it is the mentality, some of it is handling legacy code, because again, a lot of static analysis rules center on preventative methodology, and when we get deep into an application and it's a piece of code that hasn't been touched in 5 years, if you're looking for an architectural change that you're not going to make, it's going to make you insane. So it looks like, Louise, that the voting slowed down, so close it, thanks. So 30% of you, again, say that you love it. Notice that's close to the number of those of you that have a very proactive security group, so probably not an accident. 52% of you say you use it because you have to. Okay, so that's half of you. That's not surprising. Again, generally, if you're in that model, I feel like you usually don't know what the value is, and you probably don't have the best configuration. So what you want to look for is a tool that will let you pick the rules. You can't just triage the issues afterward. If your tool says turn everything on and just triage it, you've got the wrong tool. You need to be able to pick the rules that actually apply to you, understand what they are, set severities, understand what the impact of the rules is, and be able to alter it based on package, file, author, when it was written, when it was last touched, when bugs were introduced into it, and things like that. And that will usually move you past the I have to use it into the I'm starting to see value, which of course is the same as the next one, use it but don't like it. Although this category is, I feel, more of the training category. It's the configuration is clearly wrong, but you need to understand why the things that you are finding are important. And so start pulling the chain on that. And if you look up the static analysis issue, look at the docs. The docs should explain it. If you don't agree, take a quick second read and go, really, why did someone do this? Maybe look at the paper that's referenced in the docs and understand why someone did it. If you still don't agree, turn it off. But you might change your mind, or you might turn the rule off. And that's what's important, is learn why what it's telling you is valuable, how it will prevent things, and shift your mindset from I'm looking for exploits and bugs to I'm trying to harden my code. And it's too noisy, again, the same issue. You got the wrong configuration, and the best thing you can do, trim the thing down. Trim it in multiple ways. Only look for high severity issues. Tools have numbers 1 through 5, or they maybe have ratings, critical, high, medium, low, etc. Leave only the high ones on if it's too noisy. Don't even turn high off of that. Critical only. In other words, look at each one, look at the documentation. If the documentation makes you believe that, oh man, I would fix this if I found it, I would stop the release, I would issue a patch, those are the things that you turn on first. Don't turn on the ones where you say, I would fix these in the next release. I know this sounds crazy, but to get over that hump of it's too noisy, start with critical. When you come into compliance with critical, turn on the high. For again, my definition, critical is I would fix it now, I'd patch it. High is I would fix it in my next release. Medium is I'd send it to peer review. I'm not running low or informational. I don't ever turn them on. I'm not sure I'm turning medium on except for a very mature product and project where I've already come into compliance with all the criticals and highs. I don't have any more left. So too noisy, get the severities down, get the quantity of rules down, turn off individual rules that have too many violations because they don't match your coding policy, and turn off scanning in any code that's old. A simple way is to draw a line in the sand. We're in the middle of May right now. Just say any code written before May 1st, I'm not going to look at. I'm only going to look at code as we move forward, and that'll help trim that volume down so that suddenly it's not too noisy for you. Because the noise is usually, we all get dumped into legacy projects. We get tools thrown at us. People didn't think about what the right way to use the tool is. And if we get that configuration, we only turn on what's most important, and we only scan the code that we're actually working on and going to fix. Those are generally the issues that will help us. So I also wanted to talk about, I think I got, oops, my slides jumped there on me, hang on. Let's go back. So here's the value of static analysis for security. I apologize, I'm having to use my mouse for this. The beauty of static analysis for security is that it finds real security bugs, and it's relatively low cost, right? If you look at it, the tools are, okay, they do cost money, but they're relatively cheap compared to some other tools. And they find real problems. They find problems early, and they really train the development team because they're showing you problematic code. And so as you get this warning in your IDE and you work on it, you go, oh, make sure you close all connections in a finally block. Eventually you stop having this kind of problem. The drawback is, as I mentioned, you have to have proper configuration. Otherwise, the thing just makes you insane. And the other is that flow analysis, and this is the newer technique. Flow analysis simulates what's going on in the application. And a lot of modern tool vendors only do flow analysis, and they put out the message that, hey, this is thorough, it finds everything. And because they claim that it has less false positives, the truth is preventative rules have 2% or less false positives. Flow analysis has about 15%. But because it gives you an exploit and not just good advice, it shows you here's how I can penetrate the thing, people feel like they're more valuable rules. The problem is that they're doing simulation, trying to figure out how to drive their way through your application. And so if they find something, it's awesome and it's great and it's free. If they don't find something, it has no meaning. So it's important that you have a more thorough methodology in place.
Arthur, we have a question.
Now, if we go to the next one. Sure.
Can internationalization and localization have an impact on security? And if so, what good static analysis tools are good for internal applications, considering also input and output that must be culturally sensitive?
Yeah, so it depends on the way that you've written your code, how much you're using frameworks. Obviously, the more layers that you get into your code, the harder it gets to trace an input through. So I would say there's one really good answer for this. Partly you're going to have conditional code when you get into localization and internationalization, and you need to make sure that your static analysis config is covering all of the conditional code. This is particularly problematic in C code because it may look like it's not being compiled and therefore it won't get scanned. So making sure that your configuration is handling all the variants is the first problem. And number two is making sure that you're doing your input in such a way that you can catch it. This is where people typically try to rely on flow analysis, and they run the rules twice or however many times they need to for each configuration. And I wouldn't say don't do that, but the proactive, preventative, build-it-in approach is to cease to rely on inspection, but instead build code that isn't subject to tainted data during the stream. So what we do is we take the actual input method, that get string or whatever it is, and we literally wrap it inside of the validation method. That way the length of the path is 0 and it won't matter how many variants of the code there are. So I may have an example for that as we go on in the slideshow. If not, get a hold of me and I'll show you. So yeah, let's talk about and this will seem a little odd in the context of static analysis, but quickly I want to talk about Blackbox versus Whitebox. Blackbox, we look from the outside of the box. Whitebox, we look from the inside. So static analysis is typically a white box technology. We look at the code itself and we say, is it constructed properly? At some level, we kind of go, and how could I exploit it? In Blackbox, we tend to do things like pen test and say, let me throw inputs at it and see what happens. I don't know what the guts are doing. These days, there's a new approach that takes these two things together because there's drawbacks. I don't know what's going on inside when I'm doing black box testing. I don't know what the user experience is when I'm doing white box testing. And so when we do these modern techniques, we can look at these things and we can say, let me monitor the system and look at the guts while I'm doing the outside. So looking for a static analysis tool that will monitor the same kinds of patterns at runtime, and when you're driving your pen test, it will look and say, oh my gosh, here's a flaw that we didn't catch in our static analysis run, but when we ran the pen tests, we saw it. And this is the modern, they call it hybrid analysis, glass box analysis, gray box analysis. Look for all these terms, but they take your static analysis and, you know, they take it up to the next level, right? If this was a cooking show, we'd go bam, right? But it's It's a really interesting thing that you can do to get a lot more data and to get good exploits and know what's really going on in your application. So it not only makes your static analysis more valuable, it makes your pen test more valuable and easier to use. We talked about this process a minute ago, so I think we can pass this slide. But an example, a SQL injection. Okay, so you have a fixed user input. They're generating a SQL statement on the fly. The problem can be that you get in with a valid username, without a valid username, or you get admin privileges, you get data you're not supposed to get, you can even make modification. And here's the problem when you're testing this in an application. In a simple application, I have a couple of inputs, but there's so many different paths they can take that suddenly I have a lot of different variants to test. So Richard Bender, who's been doing this since the 60s, says that the number of variants in an application tends toward the number of molecules in the universe. And what he's trying to say is, look, you can't test every variant in the application, so you need to take a different approach. And that's where, instead of simply trying to chase all the paths, we do the validation at the moment of input, and we don't worry about the path. We have less variance. So if we take an example, I apologize for using Java. It was just an easy one to do. You see we're doing here something evil. We're creating a select statement with a string concatenation. Don't do this. Just don't do this, okay? And we're executing the query, and anybody could exploit this. Somebody passes something like tick or 1 equals 1, and we start to pull data out of the database. The trick is we wrap the input in validation. Again, that's what I talked about earlier when we had the question. So we see that our get parameter user is wrapped inside the validate. This means the flow analysis tool will always find this piece of code because the number of paths is 1. There's no other way to go here. There's no way to get the parameter without executing the validation. Now, some of you will be clever and go, hey, yeah, but still, how good's your validation? And do I need to have different validation for different parts of the world? Yes. You can now test your validation. You know it's running all the time. You've solved one problem. Test your validation, make sure you're doing what it's supposed to do. And if you have to do different validations for different parts of the world, again, you now have a small problem. You don't have to chase unknown paths and hope that it worked. You can do strong tests against the validation method itself, and any input that isn't wrapped in validation like this, you can flag in static analysis and call it, you know, a proactive approach. So validate it immediately, and it will solve more than half of common web application vulnerabilities, injection flaws, cross-site scripting, file execution, things like that. Reporting is also critical, making sure that you're getting reports out. This little radar is my current favorite. So the colors in the radar are the criticality of a security vulnerability, red being critical, high, orange, yellow, medium, etc. Notice that we have a ton of things that aren't critical, don't care. The shape of these, see this little box around the radar? We have hide activities, DOS, resource consumption, DOS, unreliable execution, etc. These are those CWE technical impacts I was telling you about. So instead of just saying, hey, you have a buffer overflow, you have a buffer overflow, and it could lead to unreliable execution. And so we see that our biggest problem here in the red is that we can execute unauthorized code, and we might want to fix those before we fix some of the other things. So the shape of these this radar is pretty interesting. So make sure that your reports show you critical information that you can actually use. And one more poll, Louise, if you could stick it up, because we're going to show you some interesting stuff here. Just curious how many people are familiar with some of these terms, and I've thrown some of these out during the thing, but OWASP, or Open Web Application Security Project, CWE, the Common Weakness Enumeration, it comes from, it's managed by MITRE, it's funded by the U.S. government. CISSP, the Certified Information Security, Software Security Practitioner, and CSSLP, which is Software Security Lifecycle Practitioner. CSSLP is it's really a subset of CISSP. CISSP is more holistic. When we went back to our chart at the beginning, there was a big circle. It was the world of security. I think of CISSP as that circle. CSSLP, the little tiny circle inside, which was really about the application, that's the CSSLP. It's not just about the code. It's about how the code got built, but it ignores the firewall. It ignores the antivirus and all those other things. So it looks like people are done voting. Yes. So yeah, about a third of you are familiar with OWASP and CISSP. CISSP has certifications through the CSSLP. The government's been pushing these stronger. I'm a big fan. I have a love-hate relationship with certifications because some of them are given too loosely, but good certifications will at least tell you that your person's trained to do something. So if we go back to like my second or third slide and I said training number 1, CISSP, CSSLP will at least give you an idea that you've got some training. My second thing was we need to have slide design to make sure that we're building things properly. CWE and OWASP are those building standards that we can use to make sure that we're building things properly. So in conclusion, it's funny, when we look at static analysis for security, a lot of people take this view that I'm going to look at the static analysis finding and I'm going to find out, is it really real, is it not real? And what we see is developers really, their focus is shifted from let me secure my application to let me prove this is a false positive. And the funny thing is that the time it takes to fix the static analysis violation is far less than the time it takes to prove that it's a false positive, which is why I put up this funny slide. So, again, you know, I'm from Parasoft. We're an OWASP supporting member, SAM8 contributor. We make sure that our tools are part of the government's assessment of tools and static analysis in general. I sit on the board of these things to help move the state-of-the-art forward and contribute to CWE and SATE as well. Some resources for you, and this I think is useful. And again, this is the slide you can go to, but CWE, go to cwe.miter.org, OWASP.org. If you're in the payment card industry, if you're dealing with credit cards at all, you're subject to PCI, make sure you go there and learn. Hack.me, a great way to learn. It's really crowdsourced learning. You can stand up a little virtual machine and let other people hack it. So if you have an idea, I'm going to build something this way, I think it's unhackable, you can stand up a prototype, invite other people to try and beat it up, and you're going to improve it that way. The software assurance metrics and tool evaluation I discussed, sam8.nist.gov, you can be part of it. And the U.S. government has a wealth of information out there now that helps you understand what are the problems, what's the training, what are the right standards, all these things for free from the U.S. government. A lot of people sell these things. When you go look at them, they're the same resources packaged up. So go to buildsecurityIn.us-cert.gov. If you forget that later, just go type in Build Security In into your browser. You'll get there. And with that, do we have any other?
Yeah, we do have a question, Arthur. How does an organization rate itself on how good its secure coding practices are? Are there any standards-driven criteria that can be used for comparison or self-evaluation?
So there are some external organizations that help you do security that will generally rate you. I would look at something like CWE Top 25 being a broader standard than the OWASP Top 10, and look at your compliance with that. If you're allowing OWASP Top 10 to happen, you're pretty immature. If you're compliant with that but not CWE, you're in that, hey, we're doing it but we could do a better job. If you can run a static analysis tool and find nothing in CWE Top 25 and OWASP Top 10, you're relatively mature. So that's a relatively easy way. Nobody really gives a single score on these things. You can create a score for yourself. It's not necessarily going to translate across organizations, but I would say that even though these are just static analysis things, the fact that you're in alignment with them tells you that you're doing a good job. And if you're not in alignment with them, maybe you're doing a very black box oriented thing, it's probably not enough because it's allowing known problems to happen. Any others?
No questions coming in. Yes, here's somebody else. Do you have any tips and tricks for recognizing the cause of static analysis find that is too subtle to see by inspections?
So I'm going to try and anticipate what was really meant here, but there's two things. One is, what does the static analysis really mean? And that leads me back to the docs. The docs should explain to you when the issue fires, this is what this is why it matters, here's how you fix it, and often link back to research. So it may say, this is a CWE number 87, you look at the CWE 87, you get a history of it, understand it. So that's one thing, if it's subtle. The other is, if you're looking for root cause problems with static analysis, there's a very interesting cheap trick that you can do, and that is, if you know there's a vulnerability, you found it, it was reported in the field, you fixed it, and you wonder, was there static analysis that would find this? What I do is I run static analysis on the broken code, and I run every possible rule, and then I run it on the fixed code. Any rule that fired in the broken code and did not fire in the fixed code has a probability of being associated with the underlying root cause problem. And so I did this, for example, with Heartbleed, and found out that while we didn't have a here's Heartbleed rule, there's a MISRA preventative standard around buffer overflow that had they followed it and fixed their code according to the standard, Heartbleed would never have happened. Any other ones?
You are receiving many thank yous and very informative session from people. So we'll keep it up for another minute here, give people a chance to type in if they care to add anything else. Do you have one more slide there to...
I thought I did.
Okay, but I will just summarize it for people because we're getting a few questions. You will receive an email tomorrow automatically generated by GoToWebinar. It will contain a link on basically sending an email to me so you can get a copy of the slides. It will also have a link to the recording. We are recording this session so you can listen to it at your own leisure afterwards. And also the email will serve as a certificate of attendance for those of you who are collecting our recertification units. So with that, I want to thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day. Again, my name is Louise Termes. I am the Education Chair for the ASQ Software Division. Arthur, thank you so much for sharing your expertise and your time with us.
My pleasure. Thanks, everyone.
With that, I will bid you all